I'm so excited for our next storyteller, Please put your hands together for the amazing DELE OGUN.
On a date now forgotten, in November 1969, Master Akindele Ogun, then aged 7, was put on board a British Overseas Airways Corporation flight that was departing Lagos, Nigeria, for London at 09:45 hours. He was headed for the English bar, although he did not know. What I also did not know was that the English bar, as a barrister, was merely a transit lounge to my ultimate destination. You see, however well I drafted those applications, the letter of rejection would often follow the next day. We regret to inform you, we're sorry to say, I couldn't get past the gatekeepers. But there was to be a consolation. DELE OGUN, the author. Now, Steve Jobs once said that the most powerful people on the earth are the storytellers. I can't claim to have been inspired by Steve Jobs at that time. In fact, I never thought of myself as an author. I sent off no manuscripts, no applications. So how did it happen? It's the story of a public library and 3 blokes called John. The public library was Islington's Central Library. You see, I came from one of those families where we couldn't afford to travel. We're an immigrant family, struggling for existence. So even Butlins was beyond our reach. So my summer holidays were in that public library, surrounded by books. The children's library. You remember the stories? Hansel and Gretel, Rumpelstiltskin. Those are the ones that transported me to faraway lands, to Germany. My travel was a virtual one. And I read so many of those books. But even then, I did not visualize myself as an author. So how did it happen? The 3 blokes called John. This is how Akindele Ogun, who would have been a QC, went out of the window. And instead emerged DELE OGUN, the author. Now, the first John was a gentleman called John Shoebridge. He was a retired tax inspector, you see. And he was working at Cooper's and Library, which was my first professional job after I left the bar. John had this amazing talent of being able to explain the most complicated concepts in the plainest of English words. Now, I thought I could write quite well after reading all those books in the children's library. And we had to write advice letters to clients. And each time I drafted an advice letter and submitted it to John, it would come back with red letter amendments. Now, it pissed me off greatly. But I was determined to get to that mark where John would not make any alteration to my letters. And after several attempts, an 8-page letter went out with only 1 red amendment, a comma in the wrong place. And I said, yes. That was John Shoebridge, who taught me the art of writing in simple language, simple English. Our next John is the Reverend John Papworth. He was an interesting character. He was a radical priest who had been expelled from the Church of England. How did I come to meet John? You see, I was always full of opinions, and I read the Times. Those who aspire to the bar, we always used to read the Times. But I went beyond that. I wrote letters to the Times. And one day, one of those letters was published. And in those days, they used to write your address at the bottom. And John wrote to me and introduced himself that he used to be an advisor to President Kaunda of Zambia. He said, perhaps we should meet. So we met for a coffee. And that's how I came into the circles of John's friend. John had a gift for collecting philosophers and advanced thinkers. And once a month we used to dine in something called the Academic Inn that John used to preside over. Retired cabinet ministers would come in and they would speak, and after the dinner there would be conversations and discussions. And it must be that some of the comments that I used to make caught the attention of the third John. Our third John was John Coleman. He was a publisher. I did not know. Initially, my relationship with John was a bit distant. Why? Because John, unbeknown to me at that time, had suffered 3 strokes. And as a consequence, his mouth was slightly distorted at the dinners. And he tended to dribble into his white handkerchief. So you can imagine, I would make sure that I sat at the seat furthest from John. But his gift was that he had a marvelous talent for always producing a quotation, often from the classics. Augustus Caesar said, and he would drop it in. And it would be so apt, so on point, that John and I started sitting closer and closer together. And then he said to me on one occasion, can you write an article about Nigeria? And I said, yes, I can. I wrote it, and John published it. He then said to me, can you expand that article into a book? And I said, yes, I can. And so I wrote the article and extended it to a book, and he published it. Then he said to me, whatever you write, I will publish. Now, so many would-be writers send off so many applications and manuscripts and get those rejection letters. And there was the golden opportunity landed on my lap, and I did not know. And John kept on saying to me at each of the dinners, when are you going to write that book? And I said, John, I'll write it. When he badgered me once too often, I now took the pen and I wrote those opening lines that I read out just earlier. Now, where am I now? I'm at the point where 8 books later, my name is now appearing larger than the title of the book. Freddie Forsyth, we love you, baby, and rest in peace. But DELE Ogun is now on the stage. And this is how the brand is emerging and evolving. Now, the real highlight is that every day now I'm off to the post office and posting one of my books to some part of the world. Recently I posted a book that was going to Hawaii. I just had to look it up on a world map and said, we're in the middle of nowhere. And my book was headed to that destination. But a real kick for me, the real moment, was again back in Islington. What happened? I was in a bookshop, a small bookshop that had agreed to stock my books. They hadn't sold many copies, so I wandered in there one day. And there was a gentleman I noticed who had pulled a copy of my book from the shelf. I walked in at that moment. And I said, say nothing. I went to the aisle next to him and pretended that I was looking for a book. But I was spying him from the corner of my eye to see what he was going to do with that. If he put it back, you can imagine how hurt that I would have been. And I prayed that he wouldn't do that in my presence. He looked at it, looked at the cover. He started turning the pages. And I was still looking at it. He went to the back and he looked at the bibliography, because bibliographies were very important for him. And then the moment came. He stuck the book under his arm. And I said, yes! Then I said to him, excuse me. Do you want to look at the photograph at the back of the book? And he turned over to the photograph at the back of the book. He said, no. And I said, yes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
And I would just like to say, first of all, can we give one more round of applause for all the storytellers?
Shit.